Thank you very much. I want to, of course, thank Anthony for years of transatlantic friendship, and more specifically for the invitation to speak with you today here at Bios. Sorry about there was a little bit of a mix-up about the title. I was teaching from a book last semester that was called Ethics Without Intentions by Emilio Denucci. I don't know, some of you may know him. And that got me back to thinking about double effect, but my paper isn't really a critique or a response to him, so I decided to shift to a different title. What I mean by the title is this, that it seems to me that I haven't done any survey, so I don't know if I should say usually or most of the time, but often, at least what I read, the discussions of double effect center on questions about what is and isn't intended, a psychological question within various scenarios, a craniotomy case, different versions of the trolley problem, the Batman in the cave, blah, blah, blah. And also on what is and isn't permitted within those scenarios. So largely on psychological questions, and the moral questions are usually pretty specific. And I think that that's largely done without much underlying moral theory. When defenders of double effect defend it, they may knock down a particular criticism, say Thompson's strong thesis or somewhat weaker versions, I guess, Judith Thompson, weaker versions of which I think can be found in Francis Cam and in T.M. Scanlon. This thesis that intentions are irrelevant wholly, just across the board in Thompson, with various exceptions, and I think Cam and Scanlon, intentions are simply irrelevant to moral permissibility. So sometimes there's batting down that sort of particular argument, but I don't find a lot of effort to ground double effect reasoning in moral theory, and to engage with at least contemporary moral theory in to do that. So that's really what I want to do now. I'm the engagements with moral theory, with the literature in moral theory, particularly the recent literature, are largely suppressed in the material that I distributed in my notes. But in the background to this is work in what you might call second wave virtue ethics by especially Michael Sloat and Linda Zagzebski, work in the justification of actions by several different thinkers. There's work in value theory that engages a whole tradition, really going back to Brentano, but various versions of which are found in Ewing, Nozick, somewhat recently in Michael Zimmerman's book, The Nature of Intrinsic Value, as well as philosophical work on intention, including Gilbert Harmon's book, Change in View, Michael Bratman, and various articles where they're trying to, in part, talk about different uses of intention talk. Its importance in coordinating deliberation and planning. It's on the one hand, I don't know if I should say on the one hand, because that kind of limits me to only one other possibility, human anatomy being the way it is, on one paw, and then on another paw, the use of intentions in explaining behavior, right? So the deliberative importance obviously is forward-looking. The explanatory work tends to be either backwards looking or say sideways looking, or sometimes inward looking, right? So we explain why somebody was standing at the corner, or why they are now standing at the corner by citing their intentions. But also in deliberation, we have to keep track of our own intentions in thinking out what to do, what will frustrate, for example, other plans that we have if we now do a certain thing. So that's at least some of the literature that I'm engaging. Also in thinking about situations of conflict. In the deep background, I guess, would be some work by Henry Richardson on specification and what he calls a qualitative approach to deciding what to do when there are considerations that pull in different directions. He has some important articles from some time ago on specification of norms as an alternative to balancing values, which is a standard way of modeling what needs to be done. Actually, balancing is a particularly poor word for what they're talking about. What they really mean is comparative weighing. Balancing suggests already an output, namely that things are equalized. And that's presumably what you don't want, right? What you want to do is to see what the weight of this consideration is as compared with the weight of that decision, of that consideration, in order to guide a decision with the presumption, with the expectation and the hope that they will come out not in balance. Otherwise, you don't know, you have to go to something else to decide what to do if they perfectly counterbalance one another. So that's some of the background literature. There's also then a background bigger picture of the moral realm, and what I call, I hope not too pretentiously, the meta theory of morals, which I think a term I used here at the end. By the meta theory of morals, which sounds grandiose and even worse, Kantian, what I mean is an overview that systematizes and interconnects the theories of, say, value, comparative value, right and wrong, virtue and vice, and so on, right? So you can think of morality as having these different topics or issues, and each one can be thought of, again, a little bit grandiosely, as requiring a theory. And then the meta theory of morals, in my sense, would be a kind of overarching view that says how these theories, these particular theories, the theories of virtues and various uses of virtue talk, the application of virtue concepts, how theories of right and wrong and other so-called deontic notions, requirement, prohibition, supererogation, I don't know, did I already say forbiddenness, how those all interconnect, and especially with regard to the flow of moral justification, right? So roughly, my approach is virtue-based. I think that was the first of the terms that I listed there. So it's virtue-based, meaning two things. So suppose that you divide the realm of moral concepts into three, or at least morally relevant and morally salient, morally significant concepts into three big families. The family of what's objectively, or at least non-subjectively, good and bad. Secondly, the family of, and there I take it that's mainly about states of affairs. I take it that Meinong was just right about that. When we talk about pleasure being good, what we're really talking about is such states of affairs as you're feeling pleasure being good. So there's the realm of non-subjective value, the realm of those concepts. There are, again, broadly speaking, deontic concepts, what you ought and ought not to do, what you must and must not do, what you may and may not do, right, so those are modal terms, but then also we sometimes talk about express deontic notions in other sort of less, not obviously modal terms, that is, that don't directly involve helping verbs. So prohibition, permission, obligation, requirement, forbiddenness, and so on. So that's a second big family of moral concepts, or morally salient concepts. And the third big family are virtue concepts, or aretaic concepts. Okay, so when I'm talking about virtue basing, what I'm saying is this: my thesis in virtue basing is that at least central elements from each of those first two families are to be grounded in normatively, and even more strongly analyzed in terms of the last. So we're supposed to understand the sense in which pleasure, knowledge, health, and so on are good in terms of the virtues. That's the first thesis of virtue basing. And similarly, the way in which their opposites are bad, discomfort, ignorance and error, whatever, loneliness, I remember exactly what I said. All those are to be understood in terms of the virtues. The second thesis, or the second part of virtue basing, is that that's also true of the deontic claims. So we should understand talk and claims about what somebody ought and ought not to do, must and must not do, needs and need not do, or needs not to do, and of what's again, obligatory, prohibited, permitted, and so on. Those also should be understood in terms of and grounded and derive their grounding from virtue concepts. Okay, I won't try to defend that right now. That's just to sort of clarify what I mean by virtue basing. I like the term virtue-based moral theory somewhat better than talk about virtue ethics, because virtue ethics seems to me pretty vague as to just what's being said. So putting it in terms of virtue basing, I take it it stands as a real contrast with certain other approaches. For instance, you could have a duty-based approach to morality, or you could have a goodness or value-based approach to morality. So virtue basing stands in contrast to those, at least goodness and value as applied to, meaning the objective goodness of states of affairs. Just kind of quickly, then following Aristotle's idea that virtues are good-making features, and following it more specifically in terms of, say, Geach's, and I think in a different way, Oderberg's accounts, what's the way in which a virtue is good making is that it makes something to be a good K. So sharpness is a virtue in a knife because a sharp knife tends to be, in virtue of that, a good knife. As a matter of fact, arguably, something's being a sharp knife in Geach's view reduces, I take it, to its being a sharp knife. That's a kind of broadly Aristotelian approach, but where I want to depart from or at least tweak an Aristotelian approach is that instead of taking the relevant K, what it is that the virtues, what is the K such that a moral virtue makes you to be or helps you to be, tends to count towards your being a good K. Instead of taking that to be human being, period, we take a hint from Aristotle that a human being is as such a social animal, and to say that the relevant value of K is at least more illuminatingly presented as being good in certain relationships with people. So your moral virtues make you to be a good neighbor to me, a good parent to your child, a good friend to these people that you know, a good fellow citizen to those within your political community and so on. So that's what I mean by the second term I have listed, role relativity. So virtue basing on a certain account of virtue leads to role relativity. I think role relativity then sensibly leads to what I call patient focus. So the idea is if my moral virtues make me a good friend to you, why? What is it about my moral virtues, about, say, my being loyal and devoted? Why is that a moral virtue? Well, if it's because it helps to make me, for example, to be a good friend to you, then it must be because of the way in which my being a loyal friend to you, a devoted friend to you, is involved in your having a good life. So you, in a sense, patient, or the relata, the person to whom I'm related, it's your well-being and self-interest that is central. Again, that's something of a departure from at least an egoistic understanding of Aristotle, according to which what makes me to be a good friend, or the importance of my being a good friend, and ultimately then what makes me to be a good friend to you, is the way in which my being a loyal or devoted friend to you enhances my well-being. My suggestion is no, what's important is the way in which it enhances your well-being. Right? So that's what I mean by patient focus. It's focus on the other rather than focus on the agent, on the one who's affected by the action rather than the person who's performing the action. The term moral patience, as far as I know, was introduced by Warnock way back in his Object of Morality book, and that's the use of it that I'm roughly appropriating for my purposes. So you see what the direction is, right? Virtue basing takes you to role relativity. Role relativity, when analyzed and thought about seriously, seems to support patient focus. Another thing that the combination of virtue basing and patient focus helps to support is input drive, right? So if it's my being loyal and devoted to you that are virtues, among others, in my relationship, my role relationship with you, what is it to be loyal and devoted, loyal to you and devoted to you? Well, that consists in various mental states. So similarly, if I'm to be a good friend, I have to be loyal and devoted to you in, among other things, not just in my feelings, but also in my behavior. I have to act loyally to you. I have to act devotedly to you. But what determines whether or not I've acted devotedly to you and so on is what went into my action. It's not the output of the action, it's the motivational input to the action. So that's what I mean by input drive, and obviously implicitly that's a very strong form of anti-consequentialism. And the last, so I won't, again, I'm not trying to defend these claims here, just to try to articulate them and sort of gesture towards the line of defense that would be involved. And then the last one I think I mentioned was serial consideration. So yeah, so by serial consideration, what I mean is pretty much this, that in a case of conflict, particularly when there are several people involved, well, get to the several people. In a case of conflict, should I help this person or that person? One important question is, well, how would I stand relative to person number one if I perform act number one, as opposed to how I would stand with respect to person number two if I perform act number two. If I give the medicine, I've only got two people, I've got two people sick in front of me, only one dose of medicine, who do I give it to? Well, who needs it more? Who will be more harmed by losing it? To whom would I behave in a way that's more, at least prima facie, vicious if I deny her the medicine? So that's at least one helpful way of doing the decision making. And my claim is that's the same method we should do even if there are many people involved. So should I divide the pill 3 ways and save A, B, and C, or give the whole pill instead to D? Well, who am I harming more? Which individual comes out worse? Which individual, more important, not just comes out worse, to which individual am I treating more viciously or less devotedly if I give someone else the pill? And so we do that in turn. So that is one after another. So in a trolley problem case, no one of the 5 people on the on this track is worse off and is worse treated by me if I choose to save the one than her along with the others, and that's what matters. So I can consider each case separately. Save person number 1 by going to the left, or save persons 2, 3, 4, and 5 by going to the right. What you do is say, well, what's the case for saving person number 1 as opposed to person number 2? Once you've settled that, then you say, what's the case for saving number 1 as opposed to number 3? And then you go through. So you do them serially, one after another, with at a no point aggregating. So that's the background approach. I'm not sure where I am right now with respect to my 30 minutes, and I haven't really gotten to the
No, that's fine. You actually have 45 minutes, so you can even have until 7 if you need it, but usually kind of 10 to 7.
Okay. And by 7 p.m., I think you mean 2 p.m. for me, right?
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah.
Right, okay. Okay, so that's just a little bit about that, very, programmatic stuff at the end. So that sort of gives you the background that I'm coming from. So why think, question number 1, why think intentions ever matter morally? Well, because on this sort of approach, virtues are really the chief thing that matter morally, that determine whether your attitude, your action, your choice, your deliberation, and so on have a certain moral significance, determine what moral significance they have. And more specifically, it's attitudes of favoring that matter, and intention is simply one of those modes of favoring. So roughly, intending me harm is wrong for roughly the same reason that wanting me to suffer is wrong, or being glad that I'm suffering is wrong. Those are all modes of favoring what is to be disfavored as an evil, as something that is undesirable, which in the kind of value theory that's part of virtue-based morality is to say that it's vicious to favor those things. So intentions just being a relevant form of favoring, intending, that's why intentions matter morally. The second question was, why think intentions matter to the morality of action, right? So I think Jonathan Bennett and others have said, well, sure, intentions matter in evaluating agents, but they don't matter in evaluating actions. What matters to determining the morality of an action is the action's consequences. What determines, what matters in determining, whether the agent is good or bad, somebody who's admirable or to be condemned, are her intentions. So that's a kind of concession, right, that Bennett is making. Sure, intentions matter, they just don't matter here. They don't matter where the defenders of double effect say that they matter. What I want to say is that that's wrong-headed. One reason is that it misunderstands action itself. Somebody said that she was working in action theory. So I take it, I've just followed Davidson and I guess implicitly Anscombe. What makes an event a human action is that it was intended under some description by the agent. And the morality of action then has to do with what went into it. It's connected to what makes it to be an action at all. An action, I take it, is an exercise of agency, as I suggest at some point, right? It's a matter of acting from these motives for that goal, despite those considerations, through these means, and so on. And all of that, each of those is going to involve a matter of responding to something virtuously or viciously. So that's what feeds into the action, that's what makes the event to be an action at all. And it shapes its morality either, there are two directions to go in that. There's the more metaphysical approach out of Aristotle and especially Aquinas, that an action is a good action when it's good qua action. That is, when it's exercising agency well, to put it in my terminology. But even if you don't want to go into that more ontological, approach, you could say that what makes it to be a good action or morally right or wrong action is that it's with these considerations of motive, choice, goal, and so on, that we're getting into the stuff, the site really of virtue and vice, which again, on a virtue-based morality, has to be the stuff also of the morality of action. And some of the stuff I've done so far has to suggest maybe sticking my neck out further than is prudent, that thinking of things this way suggests that maybe we get off on the wrong foot when we follow Kant. Remember Kant's famous passage or claim, is it near the end of the Critique of Practical Reason? Probably some of you know better than I do. Remember where he says something about the three great questions, right? What can I know? For what may I hope? What ought I to do? Right. So the third one is supposed to be the question of ethics. What ought I to do? But even if you want to frame it in terms of oughts, that's not the only ought question that's relevant to action. And I think that it's more insightful to say that the central ought question with respect to action is, how ought I to behave? Should I act in a way that's kindly, that's cruel, and so on? So it's not so much the what ought I to do, that comes afterwards, right? That's shaped by the answer to the more fundamental question, how ought I to behave? Where at least one of the relevant, I would say the one that's most important, ways of answering that how, in what manner ought I to act, is one that looks to the inputs to the actions, as I said, kindly, cruelly, loyally, treacherously, justly, unjustly, respectfully, disrespectfully, and so on. So that's really the more fundamental, deliberative, and for that matter, just evaluative, judgmental question, not just in first-person deliberation, but also in second, third-person evaluation, and so on. Okay, so that's roughly the answer to the third question. Why think intentions matter specifically to which actions are morally right and wrong, right? So even if they somehow involve action, why think that even if intentions can pace Bennett be relevant in some way to the morality, not only to morality, but specifically to morality of action, why think that they're relevant to the morality of permissibility and impermissibility? Remember, that was the language that's used in Judith Thompson's formulation, right? The irrelevance of intentions to permissibility. She doesn't say that they have nothing to do with any action, that they're irrelevant to the morality of any questions about actions, only irrelevant to the question of the permissibility and impermissibility of action. Well, the answer is that there's no sharp distinction there, at least the answer I want to propose, that actions being impermissible is they're being vicious, and their being vicious goes back to what goes into them. There are problems with that account, and we could talk about some of those at some point, but that's the general approach that I want to take. To the extent that I want to challenge again Bennett's way of setting things up, right? He presupposes that there are these two realms. There's the morality of agents and there's the morality of action. The morality of action has to do with permissibility and impermissibility, and that's shaped by the action's outputs. The morality of agents has to do with goodness, badness, virtue, vice, and that's shaped by the agent's mental states. And essentially a suggestion is, they're just separate, not necessarily opposed, but deeply separate. I think that's wrong. I think that, in fact, what's going on when we talk about the permissibility of action, so-called, is that it's always about agents. When we say an action is prohibited, it's that you, or some relevant person, is prohibited from performing it. When we say that an action is permitted, it's that you, or some relevant agent, is permitted to perform it. If we say that it's obligatory, you have an obligation, a duty, to perform it. So the whole idea that we evaluate actions as if they were independent of agents is misguided. It's mistaken. Moreover, I think that's to some extent retrievable even from our ordinary language. We don't just say that the action by itself is wrong. We say that it's wrong of you to do that. And notice that's also the way we can talk about vice, use vice talk. What you did was unjust. It was unjust of you to do that. You were unjust in doing that. You behaved unjustly in doing that. You acted wrongly in doing that, right? So this Bennett's picture, according to which we evaluate actions as if they were somehow separated from agents, I think, is very wrong-headed. That's not what they're like ontologically. And certainly it's not what they're like with respect to moral considerations. We evaluate actions, again, I want to say, as exercises of human agents. And in fact, what's called the evaluation of actions is the evaluation of people in acting. Adapting at least the translated version of John Paul II's title, we evaluate acting persons, or persons as acting. I take it that's not really in the Polish original, but I like that part of the translation. I think that it gets us closer to the heart of things. We do evaluate subjects too, individual persons, but in acting, when we're talking about action, we're neither evaluating subjects, that is, persons on the whole in their character, nor actions abstracted as mere events in the world. Rather, we're evaluating a person's involvement in exercising her agency, in performing a human action. And there's every reason to expect that that would involve looking at what goes into the action from her subjectivity. Question 4 just has to do with the old problem about intentions and expectation. Why does it make any difference? If I know that dropping this bomb is going to kill the kids in the hospital, why does it matter whether I intend to kill them and thereby, demoralize the enemy and shorten the war, or instead I only intend to hit the munitions depot next door and thereby deprive the enemy of needed arms and thereby weaken them and help to win the war? Why does that kind of stuff that's all just going up here matter when the important stuff seems to be what's going on down there below me on the ground, these explosions? Well, I want to say that, again, if you look more deeply into the relevant phenomena, intentions will matter here because they are the bearers of virtue and vice, at least in this case, directly. Expectations also matter, but if on examination, I think the way in which it turns out expectations matter is as indicators. It's not that the cognitive states have moral import themselves. The difference between dropping the bomb on the enemy munitions plant, expecting to kill the kids and not expecting to kill the kids, has to do with how opposed you are to killing the kids. I mean, if you were that opposed to it, you wouldn't drop the bombs knowing this would happen. If you're less opposed to it, then even though you're not trying to kill the kids, you're willing to accept the kids dying as a result of the good you are trying to accomplish, or at least the goal you're trying to achieve by dropping the bombs. So expectations matter in this way. The cognitive states matter not directly, but only as signs, as indicators of the underlying choices and so on that are involved. And those matter because of the way in which they help us to understand and what they manifest about what you do and don't favor and how much you favor these goods, for example, the survival of the children. So it does count against your action that you're doing it, knowing that you're going to kill these kids, but it doesn't count against it in the same way as does doing it intending to kill the kids. Rather, it shows a limit to how opposed you are to killing the kids, whereas you're intending to kill them shows something quite different, namely that you're targeting the kids, that you favor the kids dying in an important way that you don't in the other case. So my claim is that the practical states, the non-cognitive states, some certain non-cognitive states matter in themselves. The cognitive states, like expectation, matter really only as indicators of certain non-cognitive states. Again, in some of my other stuff, I talk about different kinds of intentions. So do intentions matter morally or not? I'm sorry, do effects matter morally or not? And I think that the answer is a complicated one. Intended effects, yes. Very much so, simply because of what they are, which is bearers of virtue. Actual effects, very little, only as fairly unreliable and easily defeated indicators of intentions. And then you can place other things in between those. Expected effects, expectable effects, right? So maybe you don't expect this to happen. I didn't know the gun was loaded. Yeah, but you should have checked, right? It was, so even if the death wasn't foreseen, it was foreseeable, and you can be to blame for not foreseeing it when you could and should have by investigating, right? Objectively probable, subjectively probable effects, right? So there are different answers for all of those. Okay. Question 5 has to do with the impact of comparative value on choice. Roughly the idea I want to, so roughly the idea is this. If 2 people die, isn't that worse than 1 person's dying? Well, my answer is yes and no. One thing, which 2 people is it? So Anna and Betty's dying is worse than just Anna's dying. Why? It's worse for Betty. I mean, it's worse to Betty. But is Anna's dying less bad than Betty and Carol's dying? It's worse. Anna's dying is worse for Anna. Betty's dying is worse for Betty. Carol's dying is worse for Carol, and therefore I'm worse to Betty in wanting her to die than I am in not wanting her to die. But I'm worse to Betty in wanting her to die than I am to Anna in not wanting her to die. Right? So sure, I mean, there are ways in which this can be worse. But choice has to do not just with what would be virtuous, right? So remember, the account that I'm giving is the sense in which it's objectively or non-subjectively bad that Carol die is that it's undesirable, it's disvaluable in the sense that it's vicious to want, it's vicious to value those things. But it's different in choice situations. At least certain choice situations. There, we're not just comparing 2 hypothetical mental states. We're comparing, roughly speaking, actual mental states, actual intending this person, actually intending, say, Juan's death, as opposed to allowing the death of Victor and Victoria and so on. What I have in mind there is a certain fleshing out of Bernard Williams' famous Jim in the Jungle example, right? Should he kill one under Pedro's pressure to save the others? And my claim is no. Why? Because he's worse to the one, call the one Juan. It seems to be, given that it's Pedro, I'm assuming it's in some Latin American place, right? So he's worse to Juan than he is to Victor, say victim number 1, Victoria, victim number 2, is worse to any one of them. So therefore, he shouldn't do it. it gets more complicated, but I don't think it's just a comparative matter, but at least the comparison can help us to understand that. Question 7, 8 get into trickier matters. As you can tell, I'm not really happy with what I have to say on question in the answer I proposed to question 7. That has to do with suicide. Why would it be worse to kill myself or to kill you? Why would it be wrong to kill you to save you from a terrible, agonizing death you're going to face anyway, or to kill myself rather than undergo this agonizing death? The general line of response that I sketch there derives, I believe, from David Velleman. Roughly the idea is that I'm somehow valuing and responding positively to my own dignity and status in acting and in wanting to save myself, but then I'm acting contrary to and trashing my own dignity and status by aiming to destroy myself. So there's a kind of an internal conflict there, but I haven't really thought that through, and I haven't closely connected it to this kind of virtue-based role relative moral theory that I want to. So that's still a project in the works. Question 8 just goes back to the stuff from the virtues basing, the account of deontic notions, right? Why think of acting wrongly as acting viciously? There are various answers I propose to that question. One is that we intuitively move to vice talk in comparison. Remember, Geach several times gives examples about how if stealing is wrong, then teaching your little brother to steal is wrong. Well, teaching your little brother to steal maybe is even more wrong. But the way in which we phrase that is frequently in terms of badness or vice. It's even more vicious to teach your little brother to steal or to encourage your little brother to steal than it is for you to steal yourself. So that suggests that wrongness isn't something entirely different from badness and viciousness. Another argument I sometimes use is that in trying to justify or to defend our claims about what's right and wrong, we appeal to vice talk. And I want to say that, in fact, in the best or most intelligible cases, we always do. So why shouldn't I tell her that? Well, because it's lying. And why does that matter? Because lying is dishonest, duplicitous, mendacious, and so on. There's some Tennessee Williams character was always talking about the mendacity of the folks around, right? So when we try to justify actions or our judgments about what's permissible and impermissible, right and wrong, we do it, I want to say, either when we do it intelligibly, we do it either by directly bringing in vice talk or indirectly bringing in vice talk. Why shouldn't I take that? It's stealing. And, well, stealing is unjust. It's dishonest. It's mistreating somebody, and so on. Okay. Where am I with respect to my 30 to 40 minutes? Am I over?
Yeah, I think we might wind up there if that's okay with you. That's more than enough on the table.
Yeah, I think
what do you
that's
think?
probably a good place to stop. So I didn't really get through all 10, but I think you can get the line of argument I'm trying to make.
Yep,
I
absolutely.
do welcome any comments, criticisms, suggestions.
Yeah, so we'll just open the floor to questions now, which you can type in the chat or raise your hand, or just go for it, really. Anyone want to kick us off?
Yeah, I had a question about trolley cases, and I was just wondering whether, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to what you said about having to justify yourself to each individual person, but I wonder whether people stand more individually in cases of intended harm as opposed to side effect harm. Because if I'm one person who you're about to divert the trolley onto, when you explain it to me, surely I would have thought you'd say, you know, I would understand it if you said, well, look, there's 5 people on the other one. You know, that's very relevant to whether I've been unjustly treated by you. Whereas if there's only one person on the other line, then, you know, you've deprived me of my safe position, you know, for no reason at all, and that's an unjust thing to do. So I wonder whether we should be more communal in how we see what's fair in side effect cases, as opposed to cases of deliberate harm, where, you know, you have to justify that harm. And I would have thought some harm can be intended, but you have to justify that harm to each individual person who's deliberately harmed.
Yeah.
As in, you know, you were trying to kill me or whatever, you know.
Yeah, I guess the line that I was suggesting was to say, well, I'm not saving you because I'm saving her instead, and there's no greater reason to save you than there is to save her. I take it that's saying, well, there's a bunch of others on my track, isn't really a better reason to save you. You could argue that it gives a better reason to turn the trolley in such a way that it winds up saving you. But again, I want to go in the opposite direction. Well, is it a better reason morally? If so, who is treated worse if I go the other direction? And I guess I don't see that any individual is treated worse. And I want to say that ends the question of comparison. I'm not fully clear how you're bringing in the communal aspect.
Well, to me, it's very relevant to what's fair in terms of side effects. Who else is affected?
Right.
So, you know, why aren't you giving me the medicine? Well, so, you know, well, there's 2 people who need it more. You know, as opposed to deliberate harm, you know, why are you attacking me for no reason at all? You know, that's not fair. You know, the end of story. But surely when we're doing unintentional harm to people, you know, it's relevant who else is affected. I mean, you can explain to people. Yeah, you can explain to people. You know, as I say, I'm turning the trolley, you know, despite your death, because look, there's 5 people on the other line. Just like, you know, I'm withholding this medicine, you know, because I can use it to save 5 people, and you're not first in the queue. And isn't that fair?
I guess to me, the fairness has to do with each person. And I think that that's captured by the serial consideration. So why am I not giving you the pill? I'm giving it to her instead, and I don't see that you have a greater claim on me to get the pill than she does. If her need is roughly equal, or for that matter, even if her need is lesser, if there's something special between her and me, you know, that's my daughter, that's my best friend. So I guess, yeah, I think once I've said that, I've said what's necessary to say in justifying it to you. And I don't see that you're saying, well, there are a bunch of us who could have benefited from it if you didn't give it to her. Makes a difference. Which one of you has a claim on it that she doesn't have? And if there's not a good answer to that, then I don't see that I've wronged anybody. And if I haven't wronged any one of you, I guess I don't see how I've done something wrong. I mean, in a way that goes back to Anscombe's old, the title of Anscombe's old short essay, Who is Wronged? Who is wronged if I choose to save the one rather than the five? Which one of the five can make the claim she has been mistreated by my diverting the trolley in such a way onto her to save the one over there? I don't see that any of them can say that she is wronged, that she is treated viciously, treated with disrespect or contempt or something like that. And given that, I don't see in what way it's wrong. So there is a related kind of case, and that troubles me more. So my wife tells me this story, which she says is true. I've never tried to look it up. She's from the Pacific Northwest, and there was apparently some years ago a flight that was running out of fuel, and so the pilot, he couldn't make it. It was a he, couldn't make it to the airport. So we had to make a decision roughly whether to steer the plane to the left, where there weren't many nighttime lights and thus presumably fewer houses, or to the right, where there were more. Now, in that kind of case, I don't see that the number by itself matters in such a way as to give a strong reason to go to the smaller, to where there seemed to be a smaller number of houses rather than to, and thus people, presumably lit houses, rather than to in the direction where there seemed to be a larger number of lit, and that is presumably occupied houses. But what could matter is the probabilities. If I steer towards an area with very few houses, then each person has a low chance of being killed. If I steer it towards the area in the direction where there are many houses, then each of those has a higher chance of being killed, and that could be a relevant consideration. But I don't see that the number itself matters, but it could be that there's a ground for objection if somebody says, well, you imposed a 0.8 chance of death on me when you could instead have imposed a 0.3% chance on somebody by steering, in the other direction. That could be, it seems to me that could be relevant. Again, I'm not sure that I would phrase that in terms of fairness as you were doing, but I could see that as being a relevant consideration. But then notice it's that the individual is in some way harmed more, not by being killed, but by being subjected to a higher probability of death, an unnecessarily high probability of death, when the agent could have acted so as to impose no more than a 0.3% than 0.3 probability of death on anyone. That's a different kind of case. I'm not,
Okay.
not so sure about that one, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to throw in there at the end, couldn't it? I think maybe what you've both been talking about, if really you equalize everything in terms of the role relativity, if that's all equaled, as well as the intention, and all the other kinds of, we've got this kind of meta theory that's virtue based. The idea is that everything at the ground level is going to be equalized. Then Helen's saying, couldn't you say, if all else is equal, kind of thing, that the number could matter? So of course, and I think the key is maybe what you just said at the end. So the number might not matter, you know, choosing one rather than five. It doesn't matter in terms, nobody's wronged, as you want to say, but still there's some other, the other action is preferable to some, maybe even like there's less grieving families. But then there might be other considerations. So for example, like, are you on the track to the 5 people or the 1 person? Because it might just be that you don't want to pull the lever, and like be involved, be like have that as part of the causal constituent of like what's happened to you on the trolley. You might like just want to let it go out, you know. So just something that's maybe not like a moral consideration, but still you could entertain the number as being relevant in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, I could see somebody saying that. I guess I'm not convinced by it, in part because I don't see how the number is relevant, because I don't see how it's relevant to the question at issue, which is how am I responding to each person? Am I, in failing to save this person, am I responding to her so neglectfully that it's vicious? And so long as I have a decent reason that I'm sparing somebody else a similar harm, it seems to me that I'm off the hook.
Well, what about, I think what Helen was saying, what about you ask the question instead, how am I responding to these people? And then you should say it's better for fewer of these to die than more.
Yeah, but I guess I mean, part of this has to do with the patient focus stuff. I want to gloss how am I responding to these people as how am I responding to person number 1, and how am I responding to person number 2, and how am I responding to person number 3. And if in the serial consideration, I can say to person number 1, well, see, I'm responding to this person's need. That's why I'm letting you die, and her need is no less than yours. And that lets me off the hook with respect to letting person number 2 die and saving person number 1. And I can say the same thing to person number 3. See, the reason I'm letting you die is because of person number 1's need over on the left side. Then it seems to me I've justified myself with respect to each person. And I want to say I don't see why we then need to do something else and justify myself to the group as a group. If I've justified myself, I would rather say with respect to, rather than to, but with respect to each member of the group, I don't see that there's something left over such that I still need to justify myself to the group, kind of literally as a whole,
that makes
as
sense,
opposed to.
That I understand more what you mean by role relativity now. If that it always bottoms out to reduce to that that kind of like double role between you and the person. Sorry, Helen.
Just very quickly, because I don't want to hog the floor, but in other cases where we might be accused of neglect, can't it count towards whether it is or isn't if there's some other good we could have served at the same time?
Sure.
So let's say I want you to drive me to university, and I say, well, look, you're going in the same direction. Okay, surely you have been inconsiderate if you don't get 2 for the price of 1. I mean, if you were asked to drive me to the university,
That's
then but if you've got to go to the museum yourself, and that's on the same street, then you have been considerate, because 2 for the price of 1. So this is a kind of 2 for the price of 1 that affects individual rights, I think.
Yeah, but remember, I tried to give an analysis of the 2 for the price of 1 case, right? Is a smaller number of deaths is a larger number of deaths worse than a smaller number of deaths? Well, sometimes, if I could save Anne, or instead save Anne and Betty, I should save Anne and Betty. Why? Because otherwise Betty just dies unnecessarily. I could have saved her by, right, say I've got, I don't know, 2 life preservers tied to one another. I could untie them and toss it to Anne, or Alice or whatever, who's closer to me, or I could throw them a little further so that both Alice and Betty could both get in and be pulled ashore. Why on earth wouldn't I leave them together and throw them in between? Sure. So there, that's a way in which we can intelligibly say and very clearly and so on, say in what way it's worse to save the smaller number, to save just Anne when I could as easily have saved Anne and Betty. But suppose that I could throw the life preserver to the left and save Anne, or throw it to the right and save Betty and Carol. I don't see that by itself the number makes it morally imperative to throw it to the right to save Betty and Carol. Isn't that better? Well, it's better for Betty and it's better for Carol. It's sure worse for Anne. And throwing it the other way is better for Anne, although it's worse for Betty and it's worse for Carol. So I don't see that there's a simple answer to the question, is it better? Yeah, it's better for Betty and Carol, but worse for Anne. But throwing it to the left is better for Anne, although it's also worse for Betty and Carol. Is it better or worse? Well, yes or no. Yes and no. Better for some, worse for others. So again, I don't want to say that I'm not sure I see a compelling reason to say that the number by itself matters. The serial consideration stuff is somewhere in the literature, but I must say, I can't say, I don't really remember who introduced it. Maybe it's somewhere in some of Thompson's earlier.
Can I, like,
Got another question from Janice here.
I don't know if Professor Garcia knows the citation here, but Elizabeth Anscombe actually makes the argument at one point that, if you are confronted by this kind of trolley problem, she says it may be, and she's not saying in all cases, but it may be that not doing anything, is completely permissible.
Mhm.
It's not, and I take it, I don't remember if she expands on the argument here, but I take it she wants to say something like there isn't really an opportunity in certain cases for, like the conditions are not present for the kind of agent responsibility that utilitarians typically assume when they're making these kinds of calculations, right? As if like every agent at any moment like needs to make some kind of utility maximizing calculation about every outcome. And she just says, you might just watch the train go by, and I mean, you didn't set up things in a certain, anyway. I have a number of questions actually, and I'll try to
Could you just give me the
yeah, oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
the citation on that? Which
I'm trying to
article?
remember. Yeah, I'm trying to remember. It's in one of her, I think, posthumously published works. I can look it up. Yeah, I mean, I have it somewhere, but I don't. I'm like, it just came to me. Yeah, it's not an intention, but it is in one of her, one of the St. Andrews series books. Yeah.
I'd love to get that reference if you do get a chance. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. It's really, I don't think anyone else has said that, right? Like everyone's thinking about these trolley problems, but she, as far as I know, is the only philosopher who argues, actually you need not do anything, in certain cases, and it would be okay for you not to pull the trigger out. And even if that means that a larger number of people end up dying, right?
Yeah, I mean, one important source on that question is John Torek's, again, very old article called something like "Should the Numbers Count?" And he offers various cases where there are special reasons why the numbers shouldn't count, right? So suppose that there are two towns, and I remember the details of it, but roughly there's one with a smaller population, one with a lesser population. Should they pool resources to make sure that there's a supply ship that comes? And maybe the town with the smaller population says, well, yeah, provided that it's not every time, provided that it doesn't work out that every time they say, well, there's a smaller number of people over here, a bigger number of people over there, so we'll go to the bigger number. And then the next time they run the loop, well, we're going to go to the bigger number, right? They may put in that's perfectly reasonable for them to have a rule that the ship will alternate some, half the time or a third of the time, whatever, they'll go to the smaller city and sometimes, or the smaller town, sometimes they'll bring supplies to the larger town. So he has that's a kind of contractualist argument, but the idea is, that it might make sense to put in, to agree to a rule that runs contrary to constant maximizing.
There could even be a kind of Rawlsian argument there too, right?
Right.
Be...
I mean, this comes up in some of the, I know you have a question, so I'll try to be fast. I'm blanking on her name now, but it comes up in some race issues too. There's an example of the kids deciding, the high school kids deciding what's the playlist at the prom. So for the first song, they say, should we have this piece of country music or this, rap song? And so the white kids who are in the majority say, well, let's go with the country song, and the black kids lose out. Then they say, okay, it's the second one. Should we have another country song or a rap song? And again, the white kids outvote the black kids. So it turns out you get a playlist where every song pleases the majority and the minority is left out entirely. And it's a matter essentially of how the decision was made, right? If they had voted, in a different way or set up the choice situation in a different way, it would have gone differently. It's Lani Guinier, I think, is the person I'm thinking of. So she talks about that case, that kind of case, in the context of discussing what she calls the tyranny of the majority. And similarly, if you think of this kind of case, should we help the one on the left or the five on the right? Well, if you think of it as votes, well, sure, the five on the right are always going to outvote the one on the left, but does that really make it the right thing to do? And that invokes, I guess, from the opposite direction, Dr. Watt's considerations of fairness. But I was interrupting you. You had a question.
Oh yeah, no, thank you. So I guess a lot of my questions come from a kind of Aristotelian perspective here, as I'm listening to you talk about virtue basing, for instance, and maybe I'm just seeking clarification here. So I understood you to be arguing that we should understand certain goods like pleasure and knowledge in terms of the virtues. So the virtues are really foundational here, right? Yeah. And I mean, it strikes me that, to some extent, I think Aristotle wants to say the same, but he also wants to say that each of the virtues are understood likewise in terms of some good, right? So the Greek that he uses there is like the kalon. And I think there's an argument here too, right? He doesn't want to just say that, just sort of like assert that, the virtue of courage is just, good and we should accept it as such. Right. Or that moderation justice, right? So for him, I'm trying to understand this in terms of his argument here, right? Because it does seem like there is some more fundamental good in terms of which we understand the virtues too, right? Yeah. In terms of which we see them as valuable. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily in tension with what you're arguing, or
no, but it does. Yeah, it does raise an important issue about the virtues. Yeah, so I'm not on the side, although I agree with them on a bunch of other things. I'm not on the side of Sloat, Zagzebski, Robert Adams, all of whom I think treat virtues as intrinsically good. Herka is another one who takes that view. I'm an Aristotelian. I want to say that the virtues are good making and a Geachian, and that virtues are good making in that this K's virtues must help to make it a good K. There's a further question, though, as to, well, why is this a virtue? Why does this feature help make something to be a good K? I think that, you know, Thompson largely has it, Judith Thompson largely has it right. Her view, you know, she has this view, it's a partially Geachian view. So she thinks that nothing is ever intrinsically good, at least states of affairs are never intrinsically good. She agrees with Geach about that. But whereas he thinks that the only proper use of good talk is good K, a good meal or a good farmer, and so on. She wants to say, no, there are a bunch of other uses that are also okay, like being good at, being good for, being good to. She wants to say that those are all valid uses. My term for that, I don't think she uses it, is that so there are no acceptable simple predicative uses of the term good, but there are for her acceptable complex predicative uses. So nothing is simply good, but she may be good at figuring out math problems, and figuring out math problems may be good for getting into a good school, and getting into a good school may be good to do for someone who wants to be an intellectual, and and so on. Okay, so
do you think Thompson departing though from Aristotle himself in this respect? Because I mean, it's one thing to it seems fine to say that, okay, for the part of the value of virtue is that it informs what it means to be a good K, right? But there's another claim I think that Aristotle is advancing, which is that part of the value of virtue is that it, what's the word? So that it's a function of our desiring certain activities that are on his account intrinsically worthwhile, right? So like, I think Aristotle does think that there are intrinsically good activities, and the virtues are precisely those dispositions that stabilize us in favor of pursuing those activities, right? But it sounds like Thompson, really doesn't want to admit that there is anything intrinsically good. And so, I mean, I just think there's another argument in the background here for what grounds the value of a virtue for Aristotle. It's not just that, okay, the virtue is what makes something good, but also as a kind of indication of the fact that someone is the kind of agent who pursues that which, the kinds of activities that are intrinsically worthwhile.
Yeah, the part of Thompson I was trying to get to was this, that she wants to say that one of the legitimate kind of what I'm calling complex predicative uses of good is good for, in the sense in which consuming vitamins and healthy diet and so on are good for you. And her claim is that moral goodness derives from being good for. So basically, the reason that giving you vitamins or giving you medicine is morally good for her is that you're taking medicines and vitamins is good for you. I think she's right about that. And that's part of the patient focus stuff, that not only is taking vitamins good for you, but so is having a loyal friend. So the reason that loyalty is good making rather than say bad making in me as your friend is that your having loyal friends is a part of your having a good human life. You're a social animal. You need to have friends, and obviously the kinds of friends it's better for you to have that's in your interests are good friends, ones who are loyal, devoted, concerned, trustworthy, keep your confidences, and so on. So that's part of the patient focus idea. So it is the well-being. So yes, the virtues are derived from well-being, but it's a non-egoistic approach. I mean, it's that I'm advocating. I mean, it's controversial exactly how egoistic Aristotle is, and some people would want to say that his account isn't really egoistic. But in any case, however one interprets Aristotle, I'm advocating a view that isn't egoistic. There's a philosopher at St. Thomas, and I'm not going to remember his terminology, Chris Toner. You may know of some of his work. He's an Aristotle scholar. He makes a distinction between something like excellence accounts of Aristotelian virtue and eudaimonia accounts of Aristotelian virtue. And roughly the idea is that I think the eudaimonia accounts are egoistic. So my being a good, say, patriotic citizen of the city-state is good for me because I'm a social animal. I need a certain kind of environment and so on. The excellence view is different. It's simply a matter of my being a good citizen. To be a good citizen is, among other things, to be patriotic, and we don't have to push beyond that to somehow bring it back to eudaimonia in general, or more specifically to my own eudaimonia, to explain in what way my being a good citizen is virtuous. What I'm trying to do is to say that we may not need to bring it back to my eudaimonia, but we do need to bring it back to somebody's welfare, somebody's interest, but here it's going to be the interest of the people in the community. So my being loyal to the community may not always work out great for me. I might die on the battlefield, but in general, it is a way of serving the interest of the members of the community, at least the other members of the community, if not myself. I think that captures or is faithful to what I take to be Thompson's approach, Thompson's insight that moral goodness derives from being good for, in the sense of benefiting or advancing the welfare of.
Could I just jump in here quickly with a finger? So, so just to connect that discussion about what grounds the value of a virtue, since the virtues, like intentions, are the bearers of these virtues. How I'm just relating that to what you've written for question 10. So, is that how you're seeing the idea that moral features are built into and emerge from within human nature? You say. I like this comparison, that it's somewhat as shape and geometry are built into space-time and are emergent from space-time. And so, like, in the same way, would you want to say here that this kind of fundamental patient-focused good or bad that grounds the value of a virtue is itself issuing from human nature and is emergent from human nature, the human nature of the other, in your case?
Yeah, so I want to say the human nature comes in two places. So my virtues are important in that I am a social animal, and so I need to be in relationships with others. But really what makes me to be good in my relationships with you as your friend, as your fellow citizen, as your professional colleague, and so on, that's really shaped much more by your human nature. That's what I mean by patient focus. It's the, what determines the morality, by and large, of what A does to B is not so much the impact of that action on A's welfare, which is a kind of egoistic position, but rather its impact on B's welfare. So it's neither egoistic, nor, on the other hand, is it majoritarian or aggregated. It's not, and certainly it's not sort of Moorian picture. It's not that what determines the morality of how A treats B is the impact of A's treating B this way on the overall value of the world. I mean, on this sort of approach, for one thing, there is no such thing as the overall value of the world, because the world isn't the kind of K that can be a better or a worse K. So there is no just overall value of the world and so on. So I think that approach has some commonality with what Darwall wants to call a second person standpoint. I take it that what's valuable in Darwall's idea is not that it's second personal, but rather that it's interpersonal or person to person. So what really matters with respect to A's treatment of B is neither how that impacts the agent A, as in egoism, nor how it impacts the greater good or the value in the world or the value in the world of the world. What matters is chiefly how that makes A stand in relation to B, and that's largely going to be shaped by B's interests, needs, welfare, well-being, whatever you want to, however you want to put that. Did Anthony have a?
Yeah, Anthony's written. I'll just read out the question. So, yep, he's coming in here at the last minute with all these questions. If A is saved by B at the cost of 100 people, might it not be part of A's need not to be rescued in such a way at such cost? In other words, the rescue is a cost to her and might harm her in some way, for example, being involved in a catastrophe, even if it saved her life. And so again, this is and then the observation he makes is Kant asks, what shall I do? And you focus on how should I do it? But isn't Kant very concerned, indeed, how am I motivated to do what I shall do? So yeah, maybe his suggestion you're maybe a bit more Kantian after all.
Yeah, that part of Kant I do think is I can get on board with some of that. I mean, the language, the terminology in Kant is very obscure, but if you construe maxims as something like reasons, and reasons as issues of personal motivation and commitment in the agent and so on, then yeah, that part of Kant seems to me to be right. And of course, Kant is very good in sneering at what's translated in various ways, but at one point at the, what does he call it, the serpent windings of the theory of happiness, the efforts to justify all sorts of things in terms of overall utility. Isn't it wrong just to torture a kid? Well, suppose that, that kind of, Kant, again, in the, at least in one translation, called serpent winding. So certainly, yeah, I'm thoroughly on Kant's side in that sort of anti-consequentialism and the deeper and to some of the deeper theory behind it, which he frames, I think, in the pretty cumbersome and hard to get language of universalization, maxims, laws, and so on. But insofar as that's properly understood as invoking the agent's reasons, intentions, choices, and so on, yeah, on all of that, I'm with Kant. On the first of Anthony's questions, yeah, I guess I haven't really thought about thought about that. Right, so what he's suggesting, if I understand him, is that if the only way to save A is to let all of these people die because I'm just saving A, and I could instead save the 100, then there's a question, doesn't A's need to not be rescued in such a way at such a cost count? The rescue is a cost to A, might be said to harm her in some way by involving her in a catastrophe. Yeah, I guess it's not a case I've thought about much. I guess I have to think about how it goes, but suppose Nate, who's nasty, throws a grenade over by you. I'm standing by you too. So I could well, run away, save myself and let you die. Or I could pick the grenade up and throw it. I know that that'll be safe because I can, it's got a big timer counting down on it. And it's, says that there's plenty of time for me to pick up the grenade and throw it. Unfortunately, the only place I can throw it, maybe we're in a cave or something, is over there where the 100 people. So is it wrong for me to throw the grenade to save A, knowing that by throwing it, I'll kill the 100 on the, down the, whatever it is, at the other end of the tunnel or over the fence or something like that, into the other room, right? Yeah, maybe set it up like that, right? So we're in the ante room to the lecture hall. Nate has thrown the grenade in with us. There are no windows. The only way to get rid of the grenade is to throw it into the lecture hall. That way I save you and maybe me, but the people in the lecture hall, the 100 of them, are all gonna die. Anthony's asking, have I harmed the one in the room with me by saving her at the cost of all those deaths? I mean, if so, then that's a good reason not to throw it. I mean, I'm not saying that you have to throw it. I'm just saying that there's so far that throwing it is no worse than not throwing it. If you come up with a way in which it is worse even to the one to throw it, the one who is saved to throw it, then yeah. I mean, maybe she says, maybe, it's you and me in the room. You say, don't throw that. Throw that into the lecture hall. You're not trying to kill those people, but they're all going to die to save me. I don't want to be a part of that. That could be a reason not to throw it. It's a nice case, one that certainly I haven't thought of before.
Yeah, I'm just saying that's a bit of a reversal of 7. So you do a great harm to someone when it'll cause a small harm. I guess the point is that you wouldn't cause that small harm to the 100 people, presumably, or else the case doesn't work. But listen, sorry, I have to wind up this discussion. It's really excellent. I think you should be honoured. It's actually the first time that we've ever overrun, but it's just because of this fruitful discussion caused by your really great talk.
Thanks.
Really enjoyed this, very systemic and meaty. So thank you very much, and I'm sure we can all give you a virtual round of applause here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Much. It's been
Thank you
been
very
helpful.
much.
Given me
Yeah,
some
hope-
good things to think about too. So I very much appreciate your patience with my droning on, and I am grateful to you for your comments and thoughtfulness.
No, I can't get enough. Well, anyway, hopefully some of the discussions can continue via email. And it was great to see all of you and do some philosophy with you. So hopefully we'll see some of you for the next seminar next month. And yes, Ilaria has told me to remind you all to join all our socials. That's great. Right, okay, so all the best and see you soon.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Send me that
Garcia.
Hanscom article, please, or
I will, yeah.
the citation for it. Thanks a lot.
Okay,
Bye
will
now.
do.